Hi, I'm Claire Fyson. In this presentation, MJ and I will be talking through some existing governance architecture for carbon removal, the gaps and challenges in governance that will need to be addressed before we can actually scale up CDR deployment, and some priorities for how we might address these gaps. This builds upon work that we've been engaged with over the past couple of years. We're actually in the process of updating a report that we wrote in 2018 on governance issues related to carbon dioxide removal. So keep an eye on our website and C2G's website to find out more. So firstly, a quick context on why carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, is becoming such a hot topic. As the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, showed us, all mitigation pathways that are compatible with the Paris Agreement's temperature limit of 1.5 degrees require some level of carbon dioxide removal. And this is because, despite our best efforts, some emissions, for example, from the agriculture sector, cannot be fully phased out. But also because we need to make up for years of delayed action in reducing emissions. What's important is that the scale of carbon removal depends a lot on how quickly we reduce our emissions in the near term, so over the next decade or two. And this is really important because we know that carbon removal is not a magic bullet. We also need really drastic emissions reductions. Large-scale carbon dioxide removal is not actually available at the scale that we're likely to need it at, and many options come with their own sustainability challenges when they're deployed at large scales. Also, the more CDR that we need, the more that we'll need to go beyond the terrestrial options that we have more understanding of towards more uncertain technological options. So I'll quickly go through what some of the most prominent carbon dioxide removal options are that we have available to us. So some of these are based on terrestrial sinks, afforestation and reforestation, that's planting or replanting trees to enhance natural sink. We also have soil carbon sequestration. So this is land management changes that actually increase the soil organic carbon content, resulting in the net removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And then biochar, which is a stable carbon-rich material which is produced by heating biomass in an oxygen-limited environment. And this can then be added to soils, which can improve the soil function, but it can also then store carbon within the soil. Then we have more technological options. So if you look at the bottom of the slide, you can see direct air capture with carbon capture and storage. This is a chemical process by which carbon dioxide is captured directly from the ambient air and is then subsequently stored. There's also enhanced weathering on the right-hand side. This is where we dissolve silicate and carbonate rocks by grinding them up and then spreading them out on soils, for example, and speeding up the natural weathering process, which actually results in carbon dioxide being pulled out of the atmosphere. And then there's a more hybrid approach, which is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So this combines the terrestrial sink with more technological options of CCS, where you add CCS, so carbon capture and storage, to a bioenergy facility. And in the process, that causes, given the conditions are right, that can lead to negative emissions. And there are also some marine-based options, but I won't dwell on those here. They're much more theoretical at this stage. And for some of them, the efficacy has seriously been questioned. So that would be a whole other topic. So we know that we need CDR, and this raises some really important governance issues. Who is responsible for overseeing carbon removal? Who is responsible for actually undertaking it in an equitable world? Can we track the implementation of carbon dioxide removal? Can we account for it? How do we avoid conflating carbon dioxide removal with the mitigation measures that we need? How do we stay within sustainable development constraints? And how do we ensure that the treaties that are involved in governing climate change and carbon removal aren't in conflict with each other? And I'll now pass on to MJ to speak through some of those things.
Thanks, Claire. Well, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is the primary international governance system for international CDR efforts. Of course, the UNFCCC aims to avoid dangerous climate change by pursuing efforts to limit the increase in average global surface temperature to 1.5 degrees centigrade. So under the UNFCCC, we have global goals and a global stocktake. We have national efforts to reduce emissions and enhance removals. We also have systems for tracking national greenhouse gas inventories, reporting systems, and review systems. For certain CDR options, other treaties are also relevant, including the Convention on Biological Diversity and the London Convention and Protocol. Nevertheless, the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, has acknowledged that climate change should be primarily addressed by reducing anthropogenic emissions and increasing removals of greenhouse gases under the UNFCCC. The London Protocol, which addresses the pollution of the sea by dumping of wastes and other matter, also has some provisions related to CDR, and it's important to be aware of these. So turning to the UNFCCC framework, what do we really have? As I mentioned, we have a global goal, a 1.5 degree goal. We've also agreed to reach a balance between emissions and removals in the second half of the century. We also have, under the climate change regime, 3 treaties that have supporting decisions. And we can learn from our past experience under these frameworks and build upon them. So we have the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which very broadly establishes reporting and review provisions. It also has provisions relating to reducing emissions from deforestation and the setting of forest reference levels. The Kyoto Protocol established quantified targets for a set of developed country parties. It contains land sector accounting provisions, and also it established some flexible mechanisms whereby parties could transfer reductions among them. And those flexible mechanisms contain some provisions for afforestation and reforestation, and also for CCS. And of course, in 2015, we adopted the Paris Agreement, which contains a set of nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, from parties. And from the adoption of the Paris Agreement, we've begun to establish a set of rules that include a transparency framework, so we can understand what the NDC's parties have articulated will provide, rules for global stocktake, so we can understand in aggregate where we're actually going and how far we've gotten, as well as rules for market mechanisms, and we've established some finance goals. Now, in addition to the fact that we've got treaties and a set of decisions under those treaties, we also have important guidance that comes from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And this guidance is very helpful in reporting related to afforestation, reforestation, CCS, and also BECCS. We also have special reports that come from the IPCC, the most recent of which, the IPCC, I'll just call it the land report, which is basically providing a much clearer understanding of the potential role of the land sector now in meeting Paris Agreement goals. So there's a good bit of information in that last report on different CDR options and what they might contribute from a technical perspective toward reaching the 1.5 degree goal. Now, I mentioned that we've got reporting guidance that comes from the IPCC with respect to certain CDR options. What we do have, in addition, are basic reporting guidelines that parties use in preparing their greenhouse gas inventories. And the fact that, of course, everyone's working with the same set of guidelines is important for improving transparency in country estimates of their emissions and removals. It's also important in reducing risks of double counting between parties, and also ensuring the completeness of parties' reporting, and also addressing uncertainty estimates. Guidance is given on how to address these different issues from the IPCC. But one thing that's also important to remember is that countries are coming to the reporting challenges with very different capacities. And so some countries are quite capable of reporting in great detail, and others are not. And the IPCC guidance provides different tiers of reporting to facilitate reporting by countries that are in these different situations. So default emission factors can be used, for example, if a country doesn't have national data in place. But then this itself has implications for cross-border supply chains, for example, in accounting for BECCS. And also the IPCC guidance doesn't address DACCS directly. So that's an area to point up. Now, as I mentioned, the Paris Agreement governance basically takes place through the adoption of decisions at annual meetings of the parties to the treaty process. And some significant decisions, and I won't go into detail, that have been taken recently in the last couple of years address transparency, ensuring that all parties will be reporting their inventories using the same sets of guidelines and using the same global warming potentials. Provisions that relate to how NDCs should be presented. So basically not the format in which they need to be presented, but the information that needs to be accompanying an NDC so that parties have a clear understanding of what the NDCs will be aiming to achieve. We've also adopted a decision that addresses accounting, which does mention some CDR options and how they should be accounted toward NDCs, but to be honest, there are very few specifics provided in that guidance. And in addition, the guidance only applies for second NDCs. So we essentially have adopted some accounting guidance that isn't particularly helpful on accounting. But what we do have are provisions that state that parties need to avoid double counting. And we also have provisions that require parties to adhere to a set of what we call TAC principles, that in accounting, parties need to be transparent and accurate and consistent and comparable and complete. And then the fourth interesting decision with respect to CDR governance broadly are the provisions adopted for the global stocktake. Now, it's important to remember that the Paris Agreement and its rule set is very, very, very much the product of a negotiating process. And this creates opportunities for distortion in tracking progress and in trying to plot out what will be delivered from the NDCs that have been brought forward. So parties weren't actually able to agree on detailed rules for the presentation of NDCs before parties brought forward NDCs. So as a result, we have NDCs from parties that take a broad range of forms and are of widely differing ambition. So we've got NDCs that have different timeframes. Some are economy-wide, some are not. Some are very clear about the role of the land sector, and some are not at all clear about the role of the land sector. So some are using the land sector to offset industrial emissions, for example. Some are providing separate targets for the land sector. We don't have a common approach to constructing reference levels for the land sector. There's some flexibility provided still in what accounting approaches parties decide to apply in areas that are important for this discussion, including natural disturbances and harvested wood products. And as I mentioned, the accounting guidance we've adopted doesn't apply to the first NDCs. It's recommended, of course, for the first NDCs, but it applies only to the second NDC period. We also have a situation in which parties have the flexibility to choose their own indicators for tracking progress. And of course, this presents challenges for comparing efforts across parties. So basically, we've created a system that brings everyone together, but it also creates some flexibility. And that flexibility can lead to inconsistent reporting among parties. And it also creates some perverse opportunities for parties to perhaps distort the true level of mitigation ambition that they tend to bring forward. And this can happen if, for example, parties make creative use of baselines or reference levels, or if they choose to incorporate certain activities in their NDCs that produce emission reductions while omitting from their NDCs other sectors or activities that might actually lead to increased emissions. So basically, we have a bit of a challenge on our hands. So good governance and global governance for large-scale CDR. We do have some gaps remaining. We have, of course, the mitigation gap that Claire spoke to. We have information gaps that come from moving toward the Paris Agreement system, in which we now have a set of reporting guidelines, and we will have the guidelines to track progress that all parties will be applying. We still have accounting gaps in our rule set. We have knowledge gaps about the impacts that certain CDR options may have. And we have incentive gaps. We don't yet have in place real incentives to drive CDR deployment. I'll end there. We will take up in the later presentation. We'll go into some of these gaps in governance in more detail, and hopefully can answer some of the questions that I'm sure you have at that time. Thank you.